we don't have to do everything all at once, but we can start small with, what could I do within my subject area to expose young people to the classroom? And actually, as a teacher myself, I think I've been really lucky across the course of the last year to take part in or witness many of these workplace experiences. And every single time I go into an employer with a group of young people or a group of another group of teachers, I'm learning something that makes my teaching more effective when I go back to the classroom.
Hello and welcome to Let's Make It Work, the podcast showcasing voices from across the sector, all united by one mission, making modern work experience truly possible for every young person. Let's Make It Work aims to inspire employers and educators about the art of the possible, share real-life examples and tangible takeaways you can implement in your own setting, and importantly, to acknowledge the systemic barriers many of you face whilst offering real-world solutions that work now. We'll be talking about all things modern work experience, which gives every young person access to progressive, high-quality, multiple workplace experiences throughout their educational journey. We'll also be talking about EqualX, our framework which provides outcomes for learners and a phased approach to offer breadth and depth of experiences. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please like, subscribe and share our channel. It helps more educators, employers and partners join this movement. Joining me today are three very different voices: Nicola Hall, Director of Education at the Careers and Enterprise Company, Ian Brown, Early Careers and Skills Growth Lead at Lloyds Banking Group, and Bobby Siegel, teacher, author and TV presenter. To do that, we'll be exploring the past, present and future of work experience with our special guests today. So let's dive in and let's make it work. Great to meet you, Bobby. Thank you very much for your time today.
Pleasure to be here.
Cannot wait to hear about your work experience story and your journey to where you are now. Thinking about the work experience that you have encountered throughout your life so far, what experience did you get when you were at school, and how did your school go about organising that?
It was secured, and I'll tell you where the word secured, at the end of year 10. We turned up in the science department, and in this room, I feel like I'm trying to think, there's a show called Crystal Maze where they've got pieces of paper all being launched about, and if you can just grab the right one. Ours was almost like that. We had a room with like hundreds of pieces of paper, and all of us stormed in and are rushing towards, and we'd look at the piece of paper. What's the name of this organization? Okay, W.H. Smith, 2 weeks, shop assistant, post office, sorting assistant, in a school, literally just piece of paper. And I found one that said Reuters. I'm like, oh, they seem like quite a prestigious name. And it said 2 weeks working within their media and IT department. And in the end, it ended up being a really good, productive work experience. But my other friends, some of them didn't find anything. Others picked something that looked really cool, like it had a prestigious blue chip name, but it was just being in the filing cabinet for 2 weeks. So mine is pure luck that I ended up with a really positive work experience. On the whole, there were some interesting experiences within Reuters that were unusual, which I could probably share.
But the school had sourced and organised the placements?
And this is something that's quite remarkable. So bearing in mind, this is 1999 in the state sector in East London, how they managed to source that many. But there was so much element of sort of luck of the draw. If I turned up 10 minutes later, some of my friends did turn up towards the end of break time, and all the papers were scrunched up in bunches, and the good ones are gone. So by then, again, there's nothing wrong with doing retail work, but all the things that required like cognitive thinking and using your creativity, other types of skills, they were all taken up by students.
And very random by the
very
sounds
random,
of it.
random allocation. Yeah.
So that was your experience. Did you say end of year 10 going into year 11?
Yeah, so the first week of year 11 was the actual work experience, but it was in year 10.
And was that a useful work experience? It may have been luck of the draw that you got a good one, but was it a useful experience for you when you reflect back on it?
Yes. So 2 weeks, again, when I turned up at the actual institution, they were a bit confused about why I was there. I think they were lovely men. Mostly they were men at the time at the institution, but they created tasks for me. They asked me to look at their internal system of IT and create like a flow chart and how they could optimize it. And I had to present to their like sub board and how it went. But I also spent a couple of days, because they ran out of things for me to do towards the end, in a filing cabinet. And I realized after a few hours, you need like special gloves because your fingers get worn down just
Paper
moving.
cuts.
Yeah, paper cuts. But to be honest, on the whole, that work experience did show me a lot about how initiative is required. Because had I just sat there and said, I'm happy to do anything you want, they would have been nice. But I think I said to them, give me something meaty. I'm quite clever. I like science and I like working on projects. And they gave me something. Again, it might have been a created project, but they gave me something where I felt like I was adding some sort of value to the firm.
And then thinking back to your experiences at Eton, you mentioned you got the scholarship to Eton, which is incredible. How was your work experience at Eton?
So there was very different. There was no Crystal Maze style room with hundreds of pieces of paper. It was more, okay, sort your own work experience, but if you struggle, we have a network. We can offer you things. I didn't find anything specific, but someone whose dad was a CEO of one of the major, either CEO of BT, but he was very senior up. He offered his work experience at BT, but again, like quite a high-powered work experience in terms of seeing how things operate at the board level. But again, that showed you that was all down to the connections at the school. Whereas my state school, it was luck of the draw. I had a good experience, but I had equally had friends whose work experiences were really mundane because they picked the 300th one on the floor. Whereas at Eton, pretty much everyone had a productive work experience because they were able to access senior people in organizations that would make sure that even if they're not, again, you're not going to be making board level decisions in a 2-week work experience, but you had the chance to interact with people that made decisions that impacted those firms.
Picking up on your personal journey still. So what do you wish you knew about the world of work when you were 14 or 15?
There was part of me and some of my friends that thought that if you didn't get the right piece of paper, then you wouldn't have a good work experience. But you can make it happen in any institution or organization. It doesn't matter whether you're your local dentist or a massive multinational firm. You can always find ways to have a productive, intentional work experience. But secondly, you can look for things yourself. That initiative, going and asking people, and of course, 9 times out of 10, maybe 99 times out of 100, people will say no, but all it requires one person to open the door and say, actually, wow, I love this initiative that you're showing. Let's show you around here.
Resilience in action.
Exactly.
And knowing what you know now about the world of work and the different sectors that you've worked in, do you think anything would have been useful to know?
When I was 14, 15, I've always been someone I'm generally quite brave, but I wish someone had told me you can be even more brave, because what's the worst someone's going to say to you? No, that's it. They're not going to take you to the top of the building and push you off the floor and toss you on the top floor going, sorry, you asked way too many questions. Especially when you're young, people are expecting you not to know everything. So use that to your advantage.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to ask the questions. Be brave, have that kind of self-advocacy to say, actually, I've got something to bring here and I want to learn.
Yes, don't be afraid, because I think too many people think others are going to judge you. And in fact, there's a really lovely phrase called the spotlight effect, where people imagine that everyone's watching them all the time. But the reality is, if you make a mistake, or not a mega mistake, like you send the power plant into meltdown, if you make a small mistake, for most people, they're worried about themselves, what they're going to cook for the evening meal, what their hair's like. They're not really looking at all the small little mistakes that you make. So actually, don't worry too much about small mistakes.
Thank you so much. I've definitely heard coming through really strongly, saying yes to things.
Yes.
Asking the questions, and just being aware of those transferable skills and being open to changing path if the opportunity arises.
Yeah,
and applying those skills.
It's being open-minded. And again, I find the more open-minded you are, the more you'll succeed in any workplace you go to.
Great advice. Thank you so much, Bobby.
Thank you, Sean.
Morning, Nicola.
Morning, Sean. Great to see you.
You too. Could you tell us a little bit about your role at CEC and a bit about your background, and then a bit about your work experience that you had?
Okay, that's going back a very long way. So I'm the Director of Education at the Careers and Enterprise Company, and prior to that I was a secondary head teacher of 2 schools in the northwest of England. I've worked really in education for most of my life, but equally also a little bit of industry interaction because one of my schools was a studio school. So my work experience was very traditional. It was the original 2 weeks work experience. And I did it in the pharmacy department of a local hospital. And the reason I did it in the pharmacy department of a local hospital was because my mum was quite keen for me to be a pharmacist. And she worked in a hospital, and through her network, she sorted that placement out, and I did it. And I can tell you now that from the moment I went in there, I knew that I didn't want to be organising pills and medication for the rest of my life.
That's really, really interesting, and leads on to what I wanted to ask you next around how that compares to what we're seeing now with the current landscape and the changing landscape really of work experience, and particularly the shifts over the last 12 to 18 months, because there's been some quite exciting things happening across the sector, haven't there?
Of course. So the current government have got a real ambition to give every young person access to work experience. But when we really started to think about what good looks like now for work experience, of course, the world has changed very much and continues to change rapidly from the perspective of employment and the skills that are required for employment. So we really wanted to think about how young people are able to explore their options. Young people tell us all the time that they want to experience multiple different workplaces so that they can make comparisons. They can really think about different workplace cultures and the type of environments that they might want to work in. So we really started to think about what does good look like then, from the position of how do you offer every young person equitably 2 weeks worth of work experience. And we've then built and been testing a framework to show that actually if you start early, all the way from year 7, we can really introduce flexibility into the system so that more employers can get involved and more young people can have access to different experiences and make good quality choices about what they may want to explore in more depth as they get older.
And make those really kind of informed and ambitious decisions
Yeah.
about what they want to do next.
Absolutely.
And you touched on it there around skills for the future. And employers and educators, they're navigating lots of changes, AI, hybrid workplaces, just to give a couple of examples. So how can modern work experience adapt to reflect that new reality that we're facing?
Okay, so I think it's really important that we consider work experience to be a learning experience. Somebody said to me yesterday, actually, that work experience is learning and is part of the curriculum, but just not in the classroom. And I think that it's really helpful for us to frame how we think young people will develop in that context, because really the point of work experience beyond exploration is also starting to develop some of the skills that might be needed for the workplace themselves. And of course, you will recognise the narrative that we hear all the time, which is young people are not work ready, they don't leave school with the skills that they need for the workplace. But frankly, unless they've been exposed to those workplaces and given an opportunity to really understand what skills are expected of them, it's quite difficult for them to be able to then articulate what those skills are. So what we've really done is built a framework that allows schools to think about what they want their young people to know, understand, and be able to do as a consequence of going into the workplace. And this then gives, in turn, young people the agency in their own development. The real ambition is not that young people go to lots of different workplaces alone, it's that from those experiences, they're then able to have a really good quality conversation with an employer about what they bring to the table for their organisation.
Love that. And that confidence in being able to articulate, apply, demonstrate those skills across a number of different employers, different sectors, different size businesses. The learning in what you've just described is just incredible, isn't it? If you think about that over an educational journey,
Absolutely.
and hopefully culminating in that confidence to be able to go on and make those informed decisions.
Absolutely. And I think let's be realistic about what 2 weeks really means. 2 weeks worth of learning time, ultimately, if you were to timetable it into a curriculum model, is 50 hours worth of learning. And I think if we were to translate that analogy into a traditional classroom subject, our expectations of the outcomes of that learning would be pretty high for 50 hours worth of curriculum time.
I just wanted to touch on something that you said there about this 2 weeks worth and embedded throughout the curriculum. And we often hear that work experience is a challenge for schools. They're stretched in every direction, as are employers. So from your experience, what are the gaps that we still need to close to make sure work experience is modern, it is equitable, and it is meaningful, as you've just described?
Yeah, of course. I think it's reasonable for us to assume these days that young people want their curriculum to be connected to their futures. they really want to see their curriculum and what they're learning in subject areas as relevant and purposeful in terms of helping them to make decisions about what they might want to do beyond school, whether that's into further education or into employment and training. But in reality, taking young people into the workplace is probably one of the best ways of applying the curriculum concepts in the real world. And when young people hear from employers about the possibilities of being able to do that, then they're able to take that relevance back into the classroom and really engage with their subject areas. And so when we talk about gaps and equity for young people, we really need to think about every young person that's sat in front of us in our classes. And when we're teaching our classes of 30 children, we wouldn't actively leave some young people out of activities. But of course, that happens still with work experience. So we know that of the work experience that's happening right now, and let's remember, this isn't a policy yet, this is just an ambition at this stage, but we know that there are a proportion of young people that don't access traditional work experience in its current format. And so really, in order to address those gaps, what we're able to do by being much more flexible with the models is say, how do we design programs of workplace experiences that are genuinely linked to and embedded in the curriculum that make sure every single learner has got access to workplaces? And some of those might be very short visits spread out over a period of time that equate to 10 days over Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. For some learners, they might be longer placements because they already know what they want to explore in more depth. But ultimately, the opportunities that the new Equalex framework present and the opportunities of really thinking about how we plan our curriculum models to embed workplace experiences gives us the opportunity as educators to make sure that we're in control of those interventions. At the moment, the gaps often exist because the work experience landscape relies on parents. And so if your parents have the social capital and their networks to organise your placement, then of course you get a placement. But it's often limiting in the fact that it's organised by your parents in its own right. So this flexibility gives educators the opportunity to make sure that all young people genuinely are accessing opportunities. But at the same time, the flexibility offers more employers, the opportunity to get involved on their terms, not in a traditional block model that suits the school calendar, not the learner or the employer.
Thank you. I just love what you're saying there about the flexibility of the model, the breadth of actually this being possible in every curriculum area, and actually doing it in a very intentional way. Is what is going to make the difference for those young people that need it the most.
Absolutely.
And it links to the updates to the statutory guidance for careers, which has been updated recently. So would you mind just summarising what shifted and what that practically means for schools delivering work experience now?
Of course. So the statutory guidance for careers was updated in May of 2025, and it does two things. It outlines for careers leaders and school leaders the necessity of upholding the Gatsby benchmarks, which have been updated following a period of 2 years' worth of really intensive research by the Gatsby Foundation. But then critically within the section around benchmark 6, the statutory guidance sets out a direction of travel for work experience. At the moment, that guidance is a heads up on what's coming down the line. So it basically outlines that the intention and the ambition will be that every young person, no matter their setting or their own circumstances or their geography, every young person will access 2 weeks' worth of high quality work experience, 5 days worth of equivalent in Key Stage 3 and 5 days worth of equivalent in Key Stage 4. But the flexibility really comes into play because it's completely within the gift of an institution to work with their local employers supported by their careers hub to be able to design a programme that's right for them and their school, and most importantly, their learners. And we see that in the guidance, the intention is that those experiences are progressive, that they start as exploratory in Key Stage 3, where young people have got the opportunity, usually often in small groups, to be able to go and explore different sectors, different industries, different workplaces. But really, by the time they get towards the latter stages of secondary, they're able to think about something that they are really interested in. And I think student interest is really fascinating when we talk about work experience, because I know that as a head teacher, I've presided over work experience models that are simply a logistical exercise. How do you match 200 young people with 200 employers for 1 week in March? And really, the intent of this direction of travel is much more about the interests of the learners, but the flexibility gives you the opportunity to move those experiences across the whole of an academic year rather than necessarily one particular week, and to really think about how a young person can then use those experiences to their own gain, ultimately their CV, but certainly their decision making.
And as you said, get excited about their learning as well.
Absolutely.
So the CEC has been testing the Equalex outcomes for learners in secondary schools and in specialist settings, and recently published the first insight briefing from the pilots. Can you tell us anything about what the pilots tell us about what works best when we redesign work experience for today's students?
Of course. So the insight briefing itself really gives us the confidence that the Equalex framework is valued by educators and employers alike. So essentially across the course of the last year, and this will continue this year, we've been testing and piloting whether those learning outcomes are fit for purpose within institutions. So we've been testing those out across multi-academy trusts and schools within them, multiple different types of schools and styles of provision, including a special educational needs trust as well, and also then been testing out that model facilitated by careers hubs in some of the strategic authorities across the country. We're expanding that pilot further this year, partly because it's been so successful, but partly because we also want to extend the reach of the programme and take it into some testing in parts of the sector such as alternative provision. So we've really found that the framework does what it says on the tin. Essentially, it gives a school and an employer the opportunity to structure their experiences and to think about the purpose of those experiences, but ultimately what we want young people to learn as a consequence of undertaking those experiences. And then, the outcomes of those of using that framework ultimately are that young people make better progress in the sense of those objectives that are learner facing. I think it's interesting because we designed the framework very much to be educationally focused. It's designed for schools to use with their learners and ultimately for learners to be able to recognise their own growth and development. But the reality of what's happened in the pilots has really shown us that employers are very keen to use the structure of the Equalex framework to help them have really great conversations with school colleagues about co-constructing effective experiences. So I think you probably recognise, Sean, that when you were in school, that often employers are very willing to help out, but they don't always know what the school wants. What does the
Totally,
school
yeah.
want to achieve, and how do we get there? And I think it's overwhelming for an employer sometimes to think about work experience through the lens of, I've got a 14-year-old coming to sit with me for a week. But it's less overwhelming if you can pick part of that framework and think, do you know what? I can really add value to this learner or this group of learners or this school for 2 hours in a really well-constructed, purposeful way. And that's what we've seen the framework do throughout the testing. So this year, moving forward, is about expansion and growth with that pilot work.
Sounds so good. And it's just, like you say, so helpful to have that shared language to support planning, to have those really intentional co-design meetings. Because like you say, the will in the sector is there on both parts, from educators, from employers.
That's right.
So it's brilliant to hear how this model is supporting that. And we know that schools need tangible implementation help, ideas and tips. So what are the 3 most practical takeaways you'd highlight from the modern work experience pilots that educators could take away and apply?
Of course. I think that the first thing is mapping what already happens within your schools. I think in all of the schools that were involved in the pilot, and we worked with about 2,500 learners throughout the pilot in different contexts and different settings, initially. But in every case, what the careers leaders did in particular was map out what was already happening within their institutions. So where were young people already accessing workplaces? But of course, then where were there opportunities within the curriculum to think about how you might access the workplace? So really kind of undertake that audit of your provision, and we really encourage careers leaders and school leaders to think about using the careers impact system to help them do that. So we have a tool which is free to access and baked into Compass, which of course you're very familiar with, called the Internal Leadership Review. And there is a theme within the Internal Leadership Review that really shines a laser sharp light onto work experiences and the processes, the resources and the approaches that schools use or could think about using in order to think about whether they're fulfilling work experience requirements for all of their learners. And I think when you undertake that mapping, it leads you into the second part of the second tip, if you like. And the second tip for me practically is really find the learners that are missing out. So use those mapping tools to work out who is not accessing anything right now. We see already, of course, that there are some very accomplished work experience programs running across the country. We are absolutely not saying throw the baby out with the bathwater here. We're saying let's look for the gaps, let's look who's missing out, and let's fill those gaps. And we do that by using data, intelligence, and mapping. So they're the first two steps. And then the third step for me is to use the resources that are currently available for you. So first and foremost, contact your local careers hub. They are readying themselves to be able to support schools in really practical ways in terms of how they start to think about building their curriculum models, but most importantly then how the local employment pipeline will be managed in order to help fulfill those work placement requests. And it's really fascinating because we took a cut of some data. Any of the careers leaders that are listening to this will likely have contributed to that data in last year's Compass returns, because we added in some extra questions about work experience. And it's fascinating because if I go into the majority of schools around the country now and ask people what the biggest barriers to work experience are, they will say there aren't enough employers. Actually, in reality, that's not what the data tells us. The data tells us that some young people have different barriers to accessing work experience, and they're not all employment related. We know that the flexibility of this model is encouraging employers to really want to get involved. And I think it's really, really important as a careers leader that your starting point is truly understanding your cohort and what they need in the context of work experience. No one single careers leader can tackle this challenge on their own. This is a curriculum design challenge. It requires education leaders, deputy heads, curriculum leaders to really think about how this can be embedded into the whole school model. I think we're at a perfect moment in time as we start to think ahead about the consequences of the curriculum and assessment review. We think about how does that interact with a forthcoming ambition for work experience, other aspects of educational provision at the moment, like enrichment. And actually, I think if I was sat back in school right now, I'd be thinking, here's an opportunity to take those three agendas and really throw them up in the air and think about what our whole school offer looks like. But you can't do that without looking at what you've got first.
That's really reassuring, hopefully, to everybody listening, that actually you don't need to start from scratch.
Yeah.
A lot of these experiences are already happening. It's about taking that meaningful guidance that you mentioned earlier and applying that to existing experiences, making them more meaningful potentially, and looking at the existing curriculum as well.
Absolutely that. And I think it's really interesting, going back to your question about the statutory guidance, the one clear instruction that gives at the moment in the context of this ambition is actually focus on doing benchmark 6 well. And I think if you pull all of this back to that principle, because you're already thinking in your institutions about how you're approaching the updated benchmarks, the kind of conceptual 2 weeks worth of work experience is a big scary thing. But if you bring that right back to what's benchmark 6 asking me to do, and how are we going to approach that collectively together as an institution, then that's the the perfect starting point.
Thank you so much, Nicola, for those brilliant insights. So reassuring and just really interesting to hear how it's all going. So thank you for your time today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, and just can't wait to get into this and get to know a little bit more. So we just wanted to start by touching on essential skills and the skills that young people develop when they come in and spend time with you. So are there any areas where you're already seeing a shortage of essential skills among young applicants, actually? And how is Lloyds working to close these gaps?
Yeah, we invested in collaboration with Skills Builder Partnership right from the get-go. I think it felt important to me as an employer that we got behind something that was researched, so it had a decent evidence base behind it, but also people who are constantly investing in researching and understanding what works. And that's something that they did brilliantly. And that's always formed the bedrock of what we do. So we're now on Framework 2.0. So we've got a new skill, planning, in there, and that's the right thing that's appeared in the second iteration of Skills Builder. And I think in truth, those skills are still enduring. At the moment, the research that we can do, because I'm part fortune teller for the world, are trying to understand where skills are going to evolve to by 2030, 2032, because it feels like a long way away, doesn't it? But when I'm standing in front of a group of year eights, that will be the world that they inherit.
Absolutely.
In there. So we only know that AI will evolve beyond recognition from how we see it today. So the big question then is about what are the human skills that are going to survive and also enable us to really harness AI responsibly. So I think the Skills Builder 8 are still really strong as a foundation in there. So that picks up listening and speaking. So then oracy being an area that we do see potentially post-pandemic as something that students have really kind of struggled with in there. But the new skill of planning, that sense of everybody being in control of their own learning and their own destiny, I think feels a really strong gear shift, and a gear shift from young people who've been through education where largely their day is structured and organized by adults, and then moving into that world of work where it kind of depends on how they show up at the beginning of the day as to how that day is going to go, and helping them go through that gear shift feels like it's really important. The other skill I would probably say is around creativity, from which the origin to that is curiosity. The curiosity to notice that something is different, the curiosity to wonder how else something can be, and how would the world be with something or without something. These all feel like they're the things that, even if I could possibly imagine the far reaches of AI, are going to be human skills that will stand us in good stead.
That's just been so interesting to hear your take on that. When I saw the updated Skills Builder framework, and the one that caught my eye was adaptability as well. So would you say that is important looking ahead, say to the next 5 years? You've mentioned 2030. What would you say, if you could take a lens into the future, will be those real kind of non-negotiable skills that young people should invest in now?
Yeah, I mean, I think adaptability, the thing with adaptability is we need to be able to translate that for young people, because I don't think anybody would argue with adaptability as being a word, and most employers will say, yes, right now we expect all our adult workforce to be adaptable, but adaptability comes with it a whole cycle of change for young people as well, is understanding, well, who am I in the first place and what's the base that I'm actually adapting from? So interesting things that we're doing at the moment are helping young people to actually understand where are their strengths, where are their preferences, where do they play naturally. The first step around adaptability is knowing yourself in the first place. And then I think that second point is the world presents different opportunities every day if you're curious enough to be able to see them. So it's that combination of curiosity and then that willingness to go for it without necessarily knowing how the final chapter of the book is going to be written, because you're the one that's going to write it. That's where adaptability comes in. Those two together are, I think, really powerful.
Brilliant.
Really, really powerful.
And actually hearing that message from an employer, hopefully multiple employers, hopefully will be reassuring for young people to think, I've actually got something to offer. and actually this is something I can bring to an interview around my ideas, my creativity, innovative approach to solutions and things like that. Is that the kind of thing that you would look for at interview from applicants?
Yeah. And it's also the thing that brings me, in a way, it brings me the greatest joy when we do certain activities with young people and then you let them loose on it and they start to realize that we've dismantled the rules and that we're not going to judge them and we're not going to mark them on things. And then that's when you see them become more adventurous, and that's where you see really interesting things come out that will surprise me, because, and that's what it needs to be. We need to have other people's take on things through that way in there.
So just moving on to the kind of, we've touched on this already, but the employer experience and that kind of investment in time as well as financial that you undertake as an employer in early careers and school engagement. How do you think that will shape Lloyd's workforce of the future?
So we're constantly having to think about skills going forward. So 2030 is near-term planning. 2032 is a little bit far out in there. And I think all employers will hold their stats around the age of their workforce and what their kind of age mix is in the workforce and who's going to lead the company going forward. And of course, increasingly, what we see now is, leadership is leaders of ideas, not just leaders of people. And that becomes quite democratizing for young people because they can be a leader of an idea at a relatively young age, even if they're not necessarily leading large divisions of different people. So it's constantly part of what we would do in human resources to be able to think that far ahead. And then what do you do with your existing workforce? But how does that inform the kind of talent that you need going forward? And this is where I think that kind of understanding that difference between meta skills, human behavioral skills, and technical skills becomes quite important. And also the speed and agility at which you can either teach or evolve those skills. So can we show people what they will need to be able to use AI in 2 years' time? Not yet, because that's evolving quite quickly. And the shelf life of anything that we do teach them is also evolving, and its half-life is quite short. But then when you look at meta skills, so skills builder skills being an example of that, they take quite a while to develop. They're quite hard to teach. They're something that you kind of live and learn and live and learn in that kind of growth cycle. And so that's why I think they become almost more important in that age of AI, because we can't just send somebody on a course to be able to develop those things. They're the things that actually take time.
They build over time.
But we will all be lifelong learners. And if anybody hasn't got that message yet, then do for 2026. We will all be lifelong learners. And actually, I think that's a good thing. I really do genuinely think that's a good thing.
So what are the challenges in work experience that you think your sector as a whole still needs to crack? And what solutions are you most excited about testing over the next year and beyond?
So I still think scale is the holy grail, because the flip side, which is a reflection on where we are, is that work experience and experience of the workplace feels like it's rationed, and we're having to put additional effort in to ensure that marginalized groups get their fair access to these things. But really, the effort that we're having to put in there is a symptom of a greater problem, which is the lack of scale provision. If we had supply side from employers that matched the number of young people who need that, we wouldn't be having to invest so much in remedial programs to be able to ensure that people aren't marginalized or locked out because of their circumstances or lack of social capital in there. And that's a shame, I think, because it means that money and effort is being spent on remedial programs. And this is probably less a statement of like an official statement from Lloyds Banking Group and more of the manifesto of Ian Brown in there, as I would like people to really focus on bringing up more scale into their scale of provision so that we move away from a world that is rationed for young people. Because when we've mastered scale, that rationing disappears, and then we can do more interesting things. And it's not easy because, of course, scale brings tensions with it. So one of the big things that we brought in was when we were running work experience, prior to me coming in, it was all side of desk, the odd student matched with the odd person here and there, nothing measured. Everybody got a completely random and different experience in there. And then we've moved to group-based programs because then we can be more intentional, we can be more consistent in what we do. Everything has learning objectives, all the safeguarding is all done the way that we would want it, and we can be more assured, and we can build a flywheel so that the students come back next year and then they get a supplementary experience, and we can do all of those things. But of course, when you're doing scale, then it's going to feel quite different for that individual student than when they only had one person looking after them. So there are always going to be tensions, and I would just like to see more scale.
More meaningful opportunities, whether
Yeah.
they, like you've described, whether that's half a day, a group, an individual, a large group, a small group.
All of those things. And that's, and that is essentially what this new model is enabling for people to think in that way.
There's so much in that, isn't there? That learner journey from year 7 right the way through an educational journey. What are the touch points? What is the learning that's happening as a result of those touch points? As you say, how can that be made really exciting, both within the classroom, outside of the classroom? So it's just so great to hear you talk from an employer angle that is your vision as well. So it's been wonderful talking to you today. Thank you so much, Ian.
Our pleasure, as always. Thank you.
I'd like to thank our guests for bringing their perspectives and opinions to this discussion today. If you'd like to learn any more about the panel, you can find their details in the description. For educators listening, how is modern work experience being implemented in your organisation? What is working well for you so far? Please do get in touch at podcast@careersанdenterprise.co.uk with any thoughts, reflections or questions. We hope you found this episode helpful and interesting, and thank you for listening. If you'd like any more information on the topics discussed today, please find the Careers and Enterprise Company website and like, subscribe and share our channel.